Which neighbor you had? Oh, thanks. Mark
Yeah.
just hit record again. Thank you, Mark. All right. Other group, anything you want to share? Otherwise, we will plow forward. All right, here goes. Now, can you see my screen? Oops, sorry. If I go here to more recent history of redlining. Good. Thank you, Marty, for the nod. All right. So more recent history can be anything, I would say, like kind of from the 50s up to today. I'm going to disqualify that. But a couple of points I wanted to make, that redlining technically became illegal with the enactment of the Civil Rights Act in 1968. The Civil Rights Act prohibited housing discrimination. Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act, made it unlawful, and I'm going to quote, to refuse to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of his or her race, color, religion, or national origin. So that Civil Rights Act was pretty all-encompassing, you know, if we think of all the things that was really intended to do. But I think as we continue talking here tonight, you know, I think you'll see that it maybe didn't do everything it was set out to do to start with. So some of you who've bought homes have probably heard the terms Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. I think, you know, I've got a mortgage recently that was sold to Freddie Mac. They set the rules for the mortgage process, and really they were chartered by Congress as a private company. And they were designed to improve credit flow through the use of mortgages. They're still around, as I say, and they're supervised and they're not a government agency, but they are supervised and regulated by the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And that was established in 2008 by the Housing and Economic Recovery Act. So it's a little bit complex. And I'm not even going to try to pretend to really fully understand it, but I'm kind of trying to lay the framework a little bit. And in part, so when I say that was established in 2008, that was part of the government bailout, if you will. So Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, as you may remember, they needed government bailout, government funding. And so they are currently owned by shareholders. The government has the option to purchase them at some point, but they have not to date acted upon that option, if you will. So they are behind a lot of some of the policies that we're going to talk about, you know, again, a little bit further along. But what they do have are these underwriting algorithms, and they're based on historic, systemic racism and discrimination. And I think if you've attended any of the sessions before this, or if you've, you know, listened to the news or anything like that, I think some of those patterns are starting to become so very obvious now that when your eyes are open and you can see some of this systemic racism. And sometimes that comes in the form of data. And these are data that rewarded traditional models of credit that were more favorable to whites. Whites have more access to traditional credit. Marty, you were just mentioning in your breakout room about interest rates. You know, right now they're at historic lows. In the 70s, they were in the 15, 16% rates. Imagine that there are underwriting algorithms that were charging Black people higher rates even. You know, so that was sort of the underwriting algorithms insurance, if you will. But I think we all know that just created more issues. Traditional credit models, they don't consider things that might have been beneficial to a Black applicant, things like on-time payments for rent and utilities. And in fact, the traditional models have even penalized for past medical debt even once it had been paid. So if at some point you fell into arrears on a medical debt, and I almost have to say, who hasn't at this point? I mean, like, medical costs can be unexpected, and a lot of times people don't have a savings in that great of an amount. So but even once that has been paid, that counted against you if you at one time had medical debt. So those are scary things. Um, there was another program I wanted to mention, because again, there were some really downstream effects that we're still seeing today, the more recent history piece of that. And that was the Clinton era National Homeownership Strategy. HUD formed a cross-sector partnership to fulfill a multi-pronged strategy to reduce building costs, make lending requirements more flexible, and provide down payment assistance. And I'm blanking remembering on the date. I want to say it was 1995 that this was begun. And it was largely successful. Some of the, again, it was cross-sector. It had some manageable goals that they were doing, and it was largely successful. And by 2004, homeownership rates in the US peaked at 69%. Unfortunately, we then had a recession, and between 2007 and 2009, so again, we're back on that 2008 period, roughly 8% of Black and Latinx homeowners lost their homes to foreclosure. Again, that was 8% compared to 4.5% of white people. So ultimately, the gap between Black and white home ownership has widened. And as of 2019, Black home ownership rates were back at 1988 levels. So the National Homeownership Strategy and the recession accelerated the commodification of land and housing and the racial wealth gap. So some could argue that maybe it isn't home ownership that should be the goal. But historically, that obviously has been one of the ways to build wealth. But there are some other models that people have proposed, and again, I would encourage anybody to, Google it, look into some of what some people have argued might be other ways to improve that disparity of racial wealth. Oops, I keep hitting my little down arrow and that doesn't work. Drag you guys up here. Okay. So redlining today. Historic racism does continue to play a role in depressing the value of Black owned homes. It's a fact, and it's not anything that we can deny as we start to look a little bit closer. This is especially true in majority Black owned neighborhoods where appraisals come in short. And that is almost the definition of redlining. Those appraisals are coming in short, which makes it difficult to sell or to purchase and get a mortgage for what the asking price is, which is discouraging. A 2018 study by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition found that 3 out of 4 neighborhoods that were redlined 80 years ago are still struggling economically today. The improvements have just not been able to continue. Home ownership, I wanted to point out a couple of things. Wisconsin has one of the lowest Black home ownership rates in the US. And that's not specifically Madison. Obviously, as we're talking about, that does include most of the metropolitan areas, but also rural. 26% of Blacks own their own home in Wisconsin, compared to 72% of whites. And you can see the national rates there are much higher for Blacks, slightly higher for whites. But that difference between 44 and 74 is still shocking, but the Wisconsin rate is troubling, I would say. And again, that rate has not, it's gone up and then it's come back down, but technically really has not improved since the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And in fact, in Milwaukee, Black people are financially worse off today than they were 40 to 50 years ago. And again, I think that is a very troubling statistic. Looking at just a couple years ago in 2019, some really startling statistics. Lenders were more likely to deny home loans to people of color than to white people with similar financial characteristics. And I want to talk about that. A lot of times mortgage lenders have said over the years, like, yeah, but if you look at different characteristics, it wouldn't look as terrible. So there have been, in 2019, there were some statistics presented that accounted for some of those financial things. It says, even when controlled for newly available financial factors that the mortgage industry had said would explain racial disparities, things like debt as a percent of income, the property's assessed value, which we just talked about, and how much of that is being borrowed, and someone's credit score. And in fact, prospective borrowers of color looked almost exactly the same on paper as the white borrowers. There were even high earning Black applicants with less debt that were rejected more often than high income white applicants with more debt. So it's a no-win situation almost for that high earning black applicant. On average, national lenders were, and I'm going to go in ascending order, okay? National lenders were 40% more likely to turn down Latinx applicants than they were a white applicant. So, and then 50% more likely to turn down Asian and Pacific Islander applicants. 70% more likely to deny a Native American applicant a home loan, and 80% more likely to deny Black applicants. And in fact, in some metro areas, the disparity was greater than 250 times more denying of Black applicants than white. And again, this was just in 2019. This is still happening. And I quoted that source on the slide here. The other thing I wanted to mention is a lot of times, you know, Marty, and again, I think in your breakout, you mentioned when you were looking for your first home, it needed to be affordable. That was my experience as well. You know, we hadn't been married long. My husband had gone to graduate school. We weren't real picky at that point because we didn't have a big savings. You know, and if you recall, if you don't have a certain amount for the down payment, you have to get the private mortgage insurance, and you have the hot costs are higher and all these things. And again, you're more likely to be denied. But according to the Center for Responsible Lending, it takes a white buyer about 9 years to save their median income for a median priced home, to save a 5% down payment, which is kind of a significant amount of time. And that's again, a median. Latinx buyers, it takes about 11 years to save that down payment. And Black buyers, it takes on average 14 years. And I think another sort of contributing factor is that historically, some people of color are mistrustful of banks. They've been mistrustful of banks, and they deal really a lot of times in cash, which is making it really hard for them to build up credit and also, you know, savings and wealth. They're not earning any interest. I know interest isn't great no matter where you've got your money in a savings account, but they're also not building up that credit. So this is just another barrier to getting that down payment. I'm going to jump to, let's kind of change gears a little bit, and let's talk about some potential ways that we can address some of these disparities. I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that can be done at the municipal level, city and county, some things that, we can do personally maybe, and then even a little bit on the federal side of things. And I'm going to offer a couple of points for that. And I'm just doing a time check. We're about at 7:30. I might go almost our whole time. I didn't think I would. So one of the first things that came up when I was researching this a little bit was community land trusts. And again, this is one I'm going to just mention it and skim over it because it seems somewhat complicated and not something I'm really fully understanding. But I did note that the city of Madison has opened up community land trusts to nonprofits. So nonprofits can participate in that program. This is where every member of the land trust has some equity in the land. And so I think it also holds that value and doesn't allow it to be developed outside of the trust. I want to jump to adjusting zoning standards. This was really interesting to me when you think of multifamily housing units. Redlining puts a premium on single family suburban housing. And again, that's just where it is less densely populated. You're not fitting as much and you're creating almost a scarcity. If you think of it at that point, there's only so much land and so many homes that can be built on a parcel. So that price is just going to continue to increase and increase to the point of being unaffordable for somebody who maybe isn't even making the median the income. And it's also not really environmentally sustainable. So just something to think about as we talk about the zoning standards. And again, this is something that can come up in a city council meeting or something. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is reparations at the municipal level. And you may have heard about reparations very recently in the last couple of years as they have been working on them in Evanston, Illinois. And really the definition of reparations in this way is that they are paying people real money for purchasing homes or making home repairs that they have historically been victims of housing segregation. And there's also been grants provided to households, and these are up to $25,000 to go toward those down payments. Evanston is a suburb just north of Chicago. Some of you probably driven by it. Reparations and addressing the inequities in the housing segregation was a top priority, and it was identified by residents in community meetings. And I wanted to be clear about that because, again, this was something that the community voiced concerns about. This is something that each of us individually can do. We can voice concerns about this and ask about it. After it was raised as a concern, city officials commissioned a historical report on city policies and practices affecting Black residents from 1900 and through the 1960s, and then even up to the present day. And the report that was commissioned detailed decades of discriminatory and segregationist policies that shaped wealth, education, and poverty for generations. These things start and they just don't change or get better. Housing segregation was identified in the report as one of the main drivers of racial inequality. And as they moved forward with actions, the city council established a reparations fund. It was budgeted at $400,000 annually. And I thought I would just throw this in there. You may wonder, well, how did they sneak that into the budget? Well, they're using revenue from the city's tax on recreational marijuana. So there you go. Something good maybe coming out of that. And you see in the definition there, it talks about qualifying households, and the qualifying households were determined to be people that were harmed by discriminatory housing policies and practices and inaction on the city's part. And it was also historical. So it may have been your parents or your grandparents. And so this is something they've been working on in Evanston. Does anybody, I'm just curious if anybody is familiar or knows anybody who lives in Evanston and can speak to that. I know we're so close. Yeah. It's pretty recent information. So that the reparations, what Evanston has been doing is potentially a national model, and there are other cities that are considering initiatives like this. Two of them right now are Asheville, North Carolina, and Iowa City, Iowa. Additionally, there is a legislation that's been proposed, HR 40, to create a similar commission to what Evanston had, but to do it on the federal level to study and develop reparation proposals. And then also that it would examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and in the US from 1619 to present, and it would recommend remedies to that. And it would also identify negative effects of slavery on living African Americans and society, because everyone has been affected by that negatively. I want to mention that the HR 40, so this proposed legislation, the last action on it was by committee in April of this year. April 14th of 21 was the latest action, and it was ordered to be amended. So again, I don't recall all of my civics lessons, but it has not been voted upon, of course, yet. It is in committee on the judiciary. And I wanted to mention that there are 2 Wisconsin Republicans that are on this committee. They are not in our districts, but I'm going to mention them anyway. Tom Tiffany, which I think we've heard a little bit about of late. Yes, Tony. He is in Congressional District 7, sort of the northern half of the state. And the other one is Scott Fitzgerald, and he is in District 5, which is sort of Jefferson County, Dodge County, Waukesha County, and Washington County. So interesting that there are 2 Wisconsin representatives there. Oops, gosh, again with that key. Okay, so here are some ideas that I'm just throwing out there as individuals. Some of these, are 3 or 4 ideas out of hundreds, but a couple of just idea starters were supporting financial literacy. This is something we talked about on the Racial Justice Committee as maybe an area of focus at some point. Supporting financial literacy looks like providing, organizing, or sponsoring services that help educate and promote financial literacy to Black people who are either students or adults or at work, in all different kinds of settings. Another way to support financial literacy is if you are looking for a financial advisor, you can use one who is Black. There is a registry of that, and I did not write it down, but I think you can Google it. But if that's a way to support someone, that's awesome, because the industry needs more Black financial advisors. And I think something that we've seen is that your people are more, there's an affinity, right? People are more willing to go to someone who they can relate to, people, or take advice from someone that maybe has lived experience. So if there's a way to promote that to more people who would utilize the services of a Black financial advisor, I think those were a couple of great ways. There are other organizations, and I've written, oh yes, I do have it down here. If you're looking for a Black financial advisor, explore the Association of African American Financial Advisors. I knew it wasn't hard, but That is a very small percentage of registered advisors, but they do have that registry. There's another organization called Operation Hope. They do not have a chapter in Wisconsin, but it looked really interesting. They're a nonprofit and they do coaching, coaching work to disrupt poverty and empower inclusion for low and moderate income youth and adults. They coach on things like homeownership, youth financial literacy, small business development, and credit and money management. Again, that's called Operation Hope. And this was an interesting note for me. In Maryland, in Prince George's public schools, students advocated and called for requiring a personal finance class in their district's high school last year. It's one of the nation's largest school districts and among the most diverse, with 55% of its students Black and another 36% Hispanic or Latino. And the courses are now required to graduate high school, starting with the class of 2024. So these kids were saying, you know, I'm not going to use Pythagorean theorem too much, but can you teach me about saving money and financial literacy? And good for them. So these are things that, you know, that we can talk to our school board about, ask about personal finance classes. The next one I have down here, this Take Root Milwaukee, looked interesting. It is a consortium of 50 organizations, neighborhood groups, housing counseling agencies, realtors, lenders, and they're promoting sustainable homeownership in Milwaukee. And what I especially liked, that again, it is a cross-sector organization. I believe also Freddie Mac is part of this consortium as well. But you know, there's no reason that Madison couldn't have an organization like Take Root Milwaukee. So it's another one to look at. There is another one called National Community Reinvestment Coalition. There's just a whole bunch of them. Repairs or improvements. There's a group called Project Home. And again, they do this at low or no cost to help people keep their houses in good repair. If you know, or if you're someone who's handy, you know, to be able to provide that service, or organize a group that can do that for people, or even sponsor it with donations, things like that. Those, as we all know, house repairs can be, again, unexpected and expensive. I always said when I had our house in Westmoreland, it was an older home. It was close to 100 years old. And I felt like someone could hand me $100,000 and it wouldn't have done all the repairs that place could have needed at any given time. So those repairs and improvements are always so important. And again, as always, communicate with your elected officials. That's one thing that we can do. We have a voice, and it's one of the strongest tools we can use. At the federal level, so we're at 7:40. We're doing great, but if anybody wants to jump in, let me know, but we'll have time for another breakout session still. At the federal level, it was really interesting to me. So we've talked a little bit about the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and really how it hasn't improved. Recently, there's been new leadership at Housing and Urban Development that has said that we really never fully enforced the Fair Housing Act. They admitted it, which maybe that was just a little bit of an advancement. The new leadership does intend to tackle systemic discrimination, and they acknowledge that it is at the heart of the homeownership gap. So, words. That was fairly recently in June that was stated. There is another piece of legislation I wanted to bring to your attention, HR 166, the Fair Lending for All Act. And this may be part of that, I guess. It is legislation that would make it a crime to engage in lending discrimination. And I think that the differentiation here is that it would make it a crime. Right now, it's sort of just like, oh, you shouldn't do that. It also is in committee, Committee on Financial Services. Brian Steele from the 1st District is on that committee. The 1st District is in Racine, Walworth, Kenosha, Rock, Waukesha, and Milwaukee counties. But again, this was another thing that Congressman Steele heard from constituents, that increasing access to home loans was important to them. And again, you can think about those counties I mentioned have probably higher populations of people of color than some other counties in the state. Just for background information, if anybody ever wanted to talk to Brian Steele, he serves on the subcommittee of investor protection, entrepreneurship, capital markets, and community housing, community development, and insurance. Some of the caucuses he's on, you can find so much interesting stuff out when you just look on these on the websites for Congress. Some of the caucuses he's on: Friends of Sweden. If anybody's Swedish, maybe you've got a little in there. House Government Efficiency Caucus, and co-chair of the Middle Class Jobs Caucus. So, I think all of those really do kind of play together, and there is obviously some commitment to that. Interestingly, he was appointed to the UW Board of Regents in 2016. He was elected to Congress in 2018. Federal Housing Finance Committee, FHFA. Again, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae's regulator, as I talked about. There are potentially fairer credit models other than what like FICO has been, that they've existed for years, and it was developed by the big three credit bureaus to compete with FICO. There are estimates that this new model would provide credit to 37 million people who don't have scores under FICO, with a third of those being people of color. One of the concerns, and I had a note here, but I lost my note. One of the issues with these new models is that the regulators have said it would cost too much and take too much time to reevaluate these models. Oh, here, I put it on my slide, is concerns about the cost and operational implications if they would have to continually test new credit scoring models. So basically what they're saying is, we want to just keep using the old credit models because we don't want to have to spend time or money to evaluate new ones. Well, I think we've just talked at length about why using the old credit models is probably a bad idea, especially if you are a Black applicant. So this is something we, would be worth continuing to keep an eye on how they do that. And then I just listed at the bottom, because I think it's just always a good idea to be able to reach out to our Congressman, Representative Mark Pocan. So I left his email and phone number information there, so it's handy, but again, super easy to Google him. A couple of things on his committees are, he's the co-chair on Defense Spending Reduction Caucus. He is dedicated to reinvesting in healthcare, jobs, education, and housing. So I think that, again, is very important tie there. And he is committed to social and economic justice. So that is kind of all I had prepared, and you can see it goes so fast and there's so much to learn. For the second breakout session here, let's do, it's 1:45, maybe we do about 7 minutes, Mark, maybe, and then come back together one last time. Sure. And I wanted to just give you some things to think about. Is gentrification a form of redlining? Gentrification being, developing real estate property in areas that you purchase at a low cost because they are more depressed values, and then improving them such that the people who live in that neighborhood have to leave. Also very topical right now is redistricting. Is that a form of redlining? So, just some starting talking points, and then maybe from some of those areas that we just talked about, if there's something you're interested in, I'd love to hear what that might look like. So, all right, Mark, go for it. Are we all back? I think so. All right. Well, I really appreciate, the conversations I heard in your different groups and some of the personal experiences I heard some of you sharing and some of your perspectives from, maybe living or growing up in other states. We all love our home of Wisconsin. There's so many wonderful things about it, but there's so much we need to work on still. And I hope we can make a difference in our little corner of the state. Is there, before we sign off, is there anything that anybody would like to just share, some last minute sentiments?
Well, Danielle, we concluded that the answer is armed insurrection.
Oh, geez.
So, I don't know if Gail and Ginny have any guns in the basement, but it's time to clean them up.
Well, on another note,
Just to see if you guys are still listening.
Right. Each one of these has, like in the beginning of our breakout group, I think we kind of all touched on, or a couple of us I know, touched on the fact of how unaware we were as individuals. I know, my father was born in 1920. We were talking about buying houses. And I just posed the question. I mean, my father had the GI Bill, and that's how he started. And it was amazingly helpful to my life. And would my father even know that he was special getting that? I bet he was totally unaware. And that unawareness has been handed down in my family until really just recently. So I appreciate these forums, and a lot of the things that you talked about today pointed me towards things that, I just wouldn't think of because it's not what I grew up with or knew. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that sentiment is a lot like what I kind of said at the beginning, which is I had the privilege of not really knowing what redlining was. I was unaware. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, well, thank you for your time today, everybody, and thanks for sharing your perspectives and letting me, do this research and helping. Hopefully, it's something that we can continue. So again, we will have another session in December. Mark, do we have a date yet? I know with the holidays it gets a little bit goofy, maybe, but
it's always, we always do it on the third Thursday of the month. So let me pull a calendar up and look.
Hey, it's the 16th of December because I'm going to be there.
Okay,
Yes.
I was just double checking and we weren't getting too close to the holidays, but so we hope you'll join us again, and tell your friends.
Thank you very much.
Danielle.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Be well, everybody.
All right, take care.